Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink. It's Monday, March 10th. Going to be joined this week on Podcast on the Brink by Ryan Corazza of Inside the Hall, author of The Minute After and Film Session, and one of the co-founders of Inside the Hall alongside me. But before we get to Ryan on this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink, wanted to take a moment, remind you that Podcast on the Brink brought to you by our friends at Visit Bloomington. Visit Bloomington is a proud partner of Podcast on the Brink and Indiana University Athletics. If you're ready to take your Hoosier basketball fandom to the next level, then plan your trip to Bloomington, Indiana. From iconic eats like Nick's English Hut to exploring the scenic trails of Griffey Lake, Bloomington is your getaway to all things Hoosier and beyond. Order your free visitor guide and begin planning your adventure at visitbloomington.com. Although the basketball season in Bloomington is over, still a lot of good things going on in Bloomington these days. The weather is changing. Great time to be on campus. Check things out. And Indiana baseball team going to have plenty of home games coming up, so make your way to Bloomington and check things out this spring. Ryan, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. It's been a while. The regular season is over. I think probably a month ago we were maybe all hoping it would be over sooner rather than later when Indiana had that 5-game losing streak, but things have changed now. 5 wins for Indiana in their last 7 games. The vibe around this team, the vibe around this program, much different. And what in your mind, first of all, welcome back to the show. It's been a while, but what in your mind has maybe contributed to this late season turnaround that we've seen from Indiana basketball? I think if we were talking a month ago, we would have all thought this was not going to happen, and it was going to be a kind of a depressing end to the Indiana basketball season. But as the tide has turned here and things are feeling much better here as the regular season concludes and we head into postseason play.
Well, as usual, the sky can be falling for a segment of the season, and then if some wins come, then the vibes, as you said, are different. I think, this has been typical of Mike Woodson's teams where, even going back to the only year they really were comfortably in the tournament, his second season, there was a January swoon there. Penn State really beat them up. They lost a couple games in a row. And then they were able to, turn it around at the end of the season or, kind of turn around from January there. And this, I think, was a confluence of a couple things. Not to discredit this, but you look at some of the wins, right? I mean, Penn State and Washington are not entrants into the Big Ten tournament later this week. Two of the poorer teams in the conference, 2 of those wins. I think Ohio State, you look at that team, pretty equal to Indiana, right? And they certainly had to kind of turn up things up at the end of the game to try to get that victory. And, credit to them. I think it was a good gutsy win over the weekend. Purdue, Woodson has always gotten his teams up for Purdue for the most part. I think, not to say that wasn't a good win, because it definitely was, but you look at how Purdue's ended their season in the Big Ten Conference. They had 7 losses. They're 13-7. I think they ended up 6th in conference. So they certainly weren't as good in conference play as they've been recent years with Zach Edey. The Michigan State win was also, I feel like I'm poking holes on all this here, but that was a really strange game. I think Michigan State ended up 14-1 this year at home, lone loss coming to Indiana. And that was when Tom Izzo was about to break Bob Knight's all-time record for wins in the Big Ten. And, Indiana played zone for much of that game, which they did for a little bit during that time of the season, something they really have completely abandoned again. I just think Michigan State mentally and kind of emotionally was a little bit out of it. And then Indiana throws that zone. Again, that's a really tough place to win. Credit to Indiana, but I think that one was also a little bit of a strange circumstances. So you kind of look at who they're playing, and I think that helped them get some of these wins. But secondarily, and it's another thing that I think people have been clamoring for forever, and that we have also seen Woodson do the last couple games of the season, is they changed the lineup. And you can go down the rabbit hole of the whole two big versus one big thing. And I think that's been well chronicled. And clearly you get some more shooting, some more spacing on the floor when you have that, as some things that I think just work better in today's game. But honestly, I almost, even more than that, I think having Anthony Leal on the floor for long stretches and for starting and has been beneficial, because Indiana's decision making and then its defense is just better with him on the floor. And all of those things, we think back early in the season where all those like offensive rebounds Indiana was giving up, and what were they doing on defense, and where was the effort, where was the hustle, why weren't they playing at a level that every other team they were playing earlier in the season was playing at. I think, it's maybe too simplistic. Maybe he's kind of rubbed off on the other guys, but every single game, there are little things that he's doing to keep possessions alive, to get a foul drawn on him, just to direct traffic on both sides of the ball. And I think having that in the lineup, as opposed to, earlier in the season, we saw, Cannon Carlisle start for many games. He was one of the big transfer names that came in, and clearly, like, offensively, he did not really perform up to a standard this year at all. And, you could say that he's decent on defense, but I think what Leal is doing is head and shoulders above that. And frankly, I'm not sure they need 5 scorers on the floor. I think it's proven out that to win these games, he obviously isn't as much of an offensive player, isn't really looking for a shot, but I think all those other things that he's bringing, and having a smaller lineup out there with more shooters, has really been the difference. And the $1 million question is, why didn't they go to this earlier, right? But as we've seen with Woodson, he'll ride something that seems unwise to do for longer than is necessary, and that's ultimately why he won't be on the sidelines next year.
So you mentioned just why didn't he go to this sooner? Do you think there's a NIL component to how teams are managed? I'm not speaking to the Indiana situation specifically, but when you put this amount of resources into a team, obviously when you start the season, if Woodson would have started Anthony Leal that first exhibition game at Tennessee and Cannon Carlisle would have been playing 5 or 7 minutes, people would have been scratching their heads and saying, what's going on here? But to your point, it is a little head scratching to see how Indiana's played recently, kind of with the lineup that they're going with, and how long they kind of rode the Carlisle and even Rice to some extent, his inconsistent play. He's now coming off the bench, and he's had moments here late in the season. That Purdue game, he was really good defensively. He's had some other games where he's really made his mark, but right now, I don't think I'd put him in the top 5 in terms of how this team's playing, like their best 5 on the floor. I'm not sure he's a part of it. So I mean, maybe just kind of peeling back that point you made a little bit more. I mean, how much of it do you think it was just the expectations of what maybe some of these guys were going to bring to the court, and Woodson maybe trying to cater to that? And now it kind of, the best example now is, I'm sure Bryson Tucker got a pretty nice NIL package to come to Indiana, and he's not even taken off his warm-up pants anymore. He's completely benched, not even in the conversation for minutes. So it seems to me like Woodson is coaching like there's no tomorrow, because for him there really isn't a tomorrow, and he's not worried about if Bryson Tucker is upset about his minutes or Cannon Carlisle, because he's not going to be the coach next year, and he doesn't really have to worry about that.
Well, that's another thing I failed to mention in my opening comments there. I think actually a huge factor, I think, in this end of the season surge here is also that Trey Galloway is starting and really running the show over Miles Rice. And I think that happened, we saw that down the stretch last season. Xavier Johnson was hurt in and out of the lineup, but at a certain point, you could just see that in terms of running off ball screens and reading a defense and knowing where to put the ball. I mean, I know Galloway, whatever, is not perfect with it, but he's certainly the best Indiana has. And I think, Yeah, with Rice, to me, he's not in. Just taking in this year only into consideration. I mean, he just hasn't really shown an ability to be able to run an offense like Galloway consistently. I think he doesn't see the floor as well. He doesn't make decisions like Galloway, and he certainly his speed can be helpful to score. He's been decent from the 3-point line every here and there. But ultimately, yeah, I think, and especially some of his stuff in the late game, you think back to what happened to him in the corner against Maryland. I even think against Oregon, he made a couple questionable decisions when the ball was in his hand in the last minute of that game. So there's that. And I want to stress that I think Galloway these last couple of games has been really good and has been a big catalyst as well. In terms of the NIL stuff, well, it's also what is the goal here? Is the goal to win? I think early on in the season, especially what Woodson said before the season started, he had a comment about, I really learned last year guard play, right? Guard play is essential. We need better to guard play. And they went out and they had, did they identify guys that were going to play within a system that they're like, this guy has this skill set and this guy has this skill set, and this is exactly what we're missing, and we're going to make it work with the rest of the guys we have on the roster? Or did they look, I know it's not this simplistic, obviously, and I know these, behind the scenes, other assistants that people are working hard to bring players in, but when you look at like the list, it's like, okay, Miles Rice is a high up there point guard. Gannon Carlisle is like I don't know, it's scoring guard that's up high in these lists. Umar Ballo, he's the number one big man. He's the number. Okay. And to me, it was like an acquisition of ranked talent when you look back. And I think to your point, you're right. Of course, Miles Rice and Carlisle are going to be starting in that Tennessee exhibition. They're going to be starting. I mean, I don't think there was and really with Rice, or excuse me, with Renew and Ballo, you kind of say the same thing. Like, it makes sense in terms of like, let's pick out what in a sort of ranked chart here the talent is, and let's get all these guys on the floor. And ultimately, it didn't fit well. We know that because of the kind of the too big situation. Rice didn't really have room to operate. And I think, yes, you're right. As the season kind of went along with quote unquote nothing to lose here, there's kind of been a loosening of that. And the players that are putting Indiana in the best position to win and the best lineups are now winning out over what was acquired to raise the ceiling of this team. And yeah, I don't know if it's so much, well, these guys got a good NIL deal, therefore that's why they got the minutes and they were playing more. I mean, I think maybe there's some of that, but ultimately Miles Rice was supposed to be the upgrade over Galloway, right? Galloway is everyone's like, oh, he's miscast in this role. Well, ultimately, with the amount of assists he's racked up the last 2 years, I know he's got this extra fifth year, but he's high up on all-time assists for Indiana. Like, I don't know, so you could say he's miscast, but I could also say at times he's pretty dang good in this role, especially of late. So yeah, it's interesting. It's really the ultimate question of the portal. And I think this year, Indiana went out and tried to assemble a team based off of portal rankings. And ultimately, as we sit here in March, the reason they may actually ultimately squeak into the tournament isn't really based off that initial lineup that it was more portal heavy for the starting lineup.
Yeah, I mean, really, when you look at the portal guys that they got, the actual best fit on this team is Luke Goody, because he brings what they needed, which was 3-point shooting ability. He's experienced. He doesn't make a ton of mistakes on the court, and he's won in the Big Ten and at a high level. He just went to an Elite Eight last season, and in many ways, him coming into the lineup and playing more minutes over this last 2 months. I mean, look back at that game that you look at some of the wins that is, if Indiana makes the tournament, you're going to look at wins that were narrow wins that really kind of got them over the hump. Not to borrow a phrase from Mike Woodson here, but that Ohio State game on the road, that was Luke Goody's best game in an IU uniform. That was kind of around the time where he started to play more extended minutes, and it kind of coincided with Malik Renew injury. I know Renew missed that game at Ohio State, but I believe that was Goody's best game, really, from an offensive standpoint. In an IU uniform, had 23 points. It's just kind of ironic to me that of the, I guess, the heralded portal recruits, Miles Rice, Kanan Carlisle, Umar Ballo, Luke Goody. Goody was probably looked at as maybe the fourth most important acquisition of that group, and to me, he's been as important. I mean, maybe not in terms of statistics as Umar Ballo, but in terms of fit and what he brings to this team as anyone.
Yeah, no, I think that's another good point, and he clearly has been getting more minutes and more run here down the stretch, and especially in a year, I don't have the Big Ten specific numbers in front of me, but you start to look at Indiana's 3-point shooting, and Mbako has really struggled in Big Ten play, and for the season, he's shooting 32%. Miles Rice is shooting 33%. Galloway is at 32.7%. So those guys, and they have a fair number of times. I mean, Baca's taken 140 for the year. Rice has taken 81 and Galloway's taken 107. And I would not have bet that Galloway was going to be a higher percentage 3-point shooter than Mbako this year. So I think that's even put more onus on Goody, who's shooting over 40.3% on the year on the most attempts on the team, 154. And I know in Big Ten play, he was at one point recently, it was up over 45%, kind of almost pushing near 50% on threes. So beyond some of the, fit that he brings in terms of just what he's doing, I think on both sides of the court, and really being the team's leader in a lot of ways. I think he vocally is the leader, which has been big. If he hasn't been hitting threes, I mean, it would really be pretty rough from behind the 3-point line this season for Indiana. So he's really kind of saved them there and hit some big shots. And they've certainly, I think really his volume too has been pretty decent. I think in previous years under Woodson, I think about Miller Kopp, right? And Woodson's statement, I'm kind of not here to get Miller Kopp, shots. I actually think he is listed as a limited role on KenPom, right? He's 12 to 16% usage rate. But when you think about like in transition, I think they're really looking for him on those kind of dump backs. And to me, he doesn't seem like the seventh option, that he is getting involved a little bit more. And, there's been games he's scored, a pretty high amount of points. I think he's broken 20 a couple times. So he's certainly getting involved in a lot of ways. And you're right, has been more of a glue and a leader guy, which is and been super important, more so than some of the other maybe splashier names or higher rated guys that came in.
Yeah, we're also seeing still a little bit of Renew and Ballo on the court together, but not as much. How big do you think that's been, just in terms of staggering those minutes? And a lot of ways, Woodson has kind of ridden the hot hand of a big guy, because they're not shooters, but in terms of just the guy who's playing better in that particular night, you see him kind of going to Renew or Ballo in that way. I mean, we saw in the Washington game, it was Renew playing a ton of minutes off the bench, and he had that matchup where he was able to exploit Washington a little bit, going to the basket both ways. And Ballo, there's been games where Ballo's maybe closed games on the court as well. Maybe not as much as Renew based on just the free throw shooting, but it does seem like while there's still moments that are head scratching where he kind of tries to force the two bigs out there, it has been a little bit more, a platoon system with Renew and Ballo, and to me that's been a pretty big adjustment as well, that maybe would have been unthinkable earlier in the season.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things with that. Certainly, I think Renew. Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is it doesn't really seem like either of them are like suffering a ton, like numbers wise, from it, if that makes sense. Right. The way they're saying it, they're not. And I think a couple things with it. One is when you think about Renew, he is the type of offensive player that can just get hot, and you can feed him a couple times in a row, and all of a sudden he's got 10 points in like 3 minutes, and he's scored a couple of buckets in a row off the kind of right low block. So he can kind of come in off the bench and almost be sort of that microwave player if the matchup is there for him. And without needing to move Ballo around, he's at least got some more room to operate. And, he's been okay. I think Ballo has been better, although I think teams have been more keyed in on doubling Ballo for him to, be the one kicking out. I think he's kind of kicking out more. He's done a better job of being an assist man than Renew. And then for Ballo, I think he's not really he's kind of a back to the basket player, but really he's been better in those high-low kind of over the top or in transition, getting him the ball ahead of the defense. And he's better on the move. I mean, Renew's not really a guy catching lobs and dunking, but Renew's really good on that. And so I think games that Indiana feels like they can exploit some pick and roll defense or some ball screen defense, he makes sense in those opportunities. And it kind of gives them, two different looks from their big guys. I think Renew and Galloway kind of playing a 2-man game and getting Ballo some looks otherwise. And then Renew, you can just feed him. So that's been kind of a balance of what they do and what they bring to the table, that I think when they've been in individually, you can play to that stuff a little bit better because there's better spacing in both regards. So yeah, it's been interesting. In Renew, I think also playing less minutes, I think it helps him stay out of foul trouble, which we know has been a big issue for him. He can kind of come in and just be really kind of laser focused on doing the things that he needs to do in smaller minutes, where if his minutes are ballooned up a little bit more, maybe he can get into those, has more time to get in some of those bad habits and things of that nature.
So coming up, Indiana on Thursday, they're going to play in the Big Ten tournament against Oregon. Obviously, it's a matchup that's fresh in everybody's minds because Indiana just went out to Eugene, less than a week ago, played Oregon, a really tough game. In many ways, I don't want to say they outplayed them, but until the last, minute and a half, they were right in that game. Oregon made some free throws down the stretch, was able to close out the win. This matchup, the circumstances are much different. Oregon has to come to Indianapolis, play at noon on Thursday, which will be a 9 a.m. Tip for them in terms of their local timeout in Oregon. It's a matchup that, I read a lot kind of after the I don't want to say read a lot. I got the sense that a lot of people feel like Indiana is in the tournament after beating Ohio State, but you look at some of these projections, you see some places have them as a 10 seed, which is not even in Dayton. You see some places have them as still in Dayton, and then you wonder if they lose to Oregon, are they potentially out? How do you think Indiana matches up with Oregon coming up on Thursday? It seemed like a game where when you watched it, Oregon just seemed faster, more athletic, almost at every position, but Indiana was right there, and they, who knows if that Jackson Shellstead shot doesn't go in, the game maybe turns out completely different. Indiana was right there. Seems like it's a pretty good opportunity for Indiana to get a win to maybe go ahead and solidify their position in the tournament. They should have a pro IU crowd. I can't imagine there's going to be a ton of Oregon Duck fans traveling in from Eugene to Indianapolis for a Thursday afternoon tip in the Big Ten tournament. So it kind of feels like the alternative was Indiana, Illinois, and we kind of saw how that played out in Bloomington. Not a great matchup for Indiana. It feels like of the two potential matchups for Indiana, this was the better one and the one that they could maybe have a chance to win.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with what you said early on there. I think Oregon, to me, when I think about all the teams in the Big Ten Indiana played this year, I'm struggling to come up with a team that, they had more length and athleticism than typical Big Ten teams do. And I think the reason Indiana only scored 5 points the last, 8 minutes plus in that game was because I think Bamba really got after Galloway, and Galloway has not really had to face a defender like that. And they got length at multiple positions and that athleticism as we're talking about here. And I think to that end, it's not a good matchup for Indiana. But I do think there are some of that. They still played them pretty well. But I just wonder if it kind of comes down another close game if Oregon's able to sort of use those advantages to close it out, especially against an Indiana team that really hasn't been great at the end of games. But yes, you're right. I think it's a really weird time on a Thursday for Oregon to have to be playing this game. And I do think Indiana will have the crowd in its favor. Although if you look at, the history of the Big Ten tournament for Indiana, being games in the Midwest hasn't always helped out. So not to say that I think Illinois would have been some slam dunk for them to win, but I don't know if it's really that good of a matchup for Indiana, to be honest. And I do think, I'm no bracketologist, but sort of looking at everything, it's weird. I feel like going into, and this is how this stuff can change with other teams winning. And, obviously there's some bid stealers probably still to come, but I think before the Oregon and Ohio State games, even felt like there was some like, well, they don't even have to win both of these and they could probably still make it. Right. And now it sort of feels like they're really on like a razor thin edge. I think that's a phrase, to make it in. And I think winning this Oregon game could be, it doesn't seem like it's a must win, but I think if they were to get another quad one victory here, it would certainly help. And then they would have more chances to do that. Obviously they got Michigan State next, who again, they have beaten, but I'm not sure, beating the 1 seed is something to expect out of this team. So it's almost like this next game, if they can win it, I think it helps solidify them a bit more to have the foundation under a tournament bid be a little bit more stable for them.
The last thing I wanted to ask you about was just, neither of us were there at the game on Saturday, but it seemed like just kind of an odd scene in the post game. I'm not sure how much you kind of looked at what they did. There wasn't the traditional senior day speeches. And from all the reporting and from everything I could gather, they played this video, like a thank you to Mike Woodson, where he said some words, and then he left the court, wasn't out there for when the senior day stuff transpired. Anthony Lill gave some brief comments, but it seemed very I don't know, orchestrated from the standpoint of to avoid what happened last year at senior day, because that's a moment that I think if we had a conversation about Mike Woodson and his tenure in Indiana and when kind of things maybe went wrong for him, I think that's one of the top 2 or 3 moments that people would point to. And that comment, the true fans comment at senior day last year, that people just still bring up. I mean, in the inside the hall community, when anyone talks about Mike Woodson, there's always someone there to respond with a true fan comment. And it felt very orchestrated from that standpoint. What just watching that from afar, we've been doing this since 2007. I've been watching Indiana basketball for much longer than that. Senior day is such a big tradition to have guys go out there and give speeches, and to not have it in its normal form this year just kind of really speaks to the circumstances, I guess, around the program, and how, I guess, odd of an ending it's been really for Mike Woodson, going back to also just his announcement that he was stepping down, which a lot of people kind of question. Was he told he's not going to be back? So this is kind of the agreement they came to. It's just been an odd way to end things, and then to have Saturday play out like it did with not having a traditional senior day and not actually having the coach out on the court when these guys are talking is just kind of maybe confirmed to me that things really needed to end, and Indiana's going to be better off with forging a new path after this season.
Yeah, I just think it's of a piece, and that is, since word started breaking that there were conversations being had and that it looked like Woodson was on the way out, that it's been handled in an odd way. It's been a very PR driven decisions have only been rendered for how the optics are. I think, Woodson has, there have been little cracks in it, and he has kind of talked about it a little bit to the media, but he never really said anything. He did not say anything in the statement that came out on that Friday when it was noted he would not be back. So to me, I don't know if this was so much Well, there were, like because of what he said last year, I just think a hot mic moment with fans, I'm not saying I know where the decision came from, but I just think it's like an overall like damage control. Let's just not let anything happen that could happen. And that's probably why it was done. And I understand why that upsets, some fans, and because it is such a tradition, but to me, it is just part of the oddness of the end of the Woodson era here, where, he was whatever it looks, for the best everyone can tell, obviously he was sort of forced out, but then, on the CBS broadcast, when he's interviewed on the court, he's like, well, maybe I shouldn't be leaving here so early. Maybe I shouldn't be retired now. It's like, wait, what? And then like at other times, the color guy on the Washington game, clear, like, and for everything that I've heard through the years, especially when those broadcasters go to talk to the coaches are pretty loose and will say a lot of stuff, right, that maybe wouldn't be on they wouldn't say on the broadcast. And the way that guy was talking, you could tell that like Woodson was basically complaining to him about having to leave and move on. And so you're like, yeah, so there's kind of been those weird mixed signals with it all. And the truth of the matter is sort of buried under some oddness. And really, I think, yes, on a senior day, it sort of looks almost the weirdest because of how they went about it, and just having video for everything. And I Leo did speak a little bit, obviously. So yeah, it was weird, but it's been a weird couple weeks, and we'll see really how this plays out. If they're able to squeak into the tournament, maybe win a game, is there ever going to be a sort of final Woodson saying this or that about his tenure? We'll see, but I tend to think it's just there's not going to ever be sort of this final press conference or whatever. I just think the season's going to end and that's going to be it. And whether he does anything with some national media member, which I know some people have sort of speculated that there might be some piece written about him that's sympathetic in that manner, if that's how he goes about it or whatever happens. But I don't think there's ever going to be like a real conversation happening about the reality of this situation. But I also think that they hire a new coach, another season happens, and time just kind of marches on, and the program moves forward. So
yeah. I mean, I guess my point was more just kind of the unfortunate way that it's ended. Like I think it would have been nice for Mike Woodson to just be able to talk about that and like give his thanks to the fans and be able to, whatever, say what he wants to say. I mean, obviously I'm not advocating for having a moment again like last year, but even you kind of throw in some of the other stuff that's gone on in terms of like the radio shows and like talking to Fish post. It's just kind of unfortunate that it's like gotten to this point, right? So, and I know there's no easy way for a program to separate from a legend like Mike Woodson in terms of his tenure at IU as a basketball player, but I think it's just hard to see maybe the way that it's ended for some fans, and I think there's a frustration from some people. There's a lot of people who loved Mike Woodson as an IU basketball player. They didn't love him necessarily as a coach for like what has happened maybe in some of these seasons, but it's just unfortunate that it couldn't have been maybe a little bit cleaner. But there's no way to make it, I guess, easy in a situation like this.
Yes, and I mean, that's the inherent risk in hiring a legend, is if it doesn't work out, you're in a tough situation, and that's what Indiana is currently living through. But now it does sound like I don't know if it was when his video thing was going, but
yeah,
he was on the court and he did get a nice ovation from everybody, from what was reported from people there. So I know that there could be more, and he could have spoken directly, but I do think that is something, at least. I mean, I know it's not everything and it's not how it usually goes, but it does seem like there was at least some warmness given towards him from the fans at the end. And, just kind of based on how everything was, maybe this was just as good as it was going to get in terms of that for any sort of a last game reconciliation, so to speak.
For sure. And so, yeah, we'll obviously have the rest of the season covered for you on Inside the Hall and podcast on the Brink. Hopefully a lot of basketball here still to be played. Indiana, as I mentioned, they've got Oregon coming up this week. Who knows? Make an NCAA tournament appearance. Three tournaments in 4 years would be a nice accomplishment for Mike Woodson, kind of based on what he inherited. And I think he's at least leaving the program in a better position than where he found it. And I think that's kind of a good way to go out for any coach. Ryan, thanks as always for taking the time to join us here on Podcast on the Brink. Always good to talk to you. For those listening to the show still at this point here, late in the episode, if you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating and a review over on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a 5-star rating over on Spotify. I noticed several of you have done that here in the past couple of weeks. Really appreciate that. And we'll be back soon, maybe next week, with an NCAA tournament game preview on Podcast on the Brink.